Marcus East, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. Excited to be here.
Marcus, can't wait to learn more from you, both your experience as well as your book, Working with Dinosaurs, How to Lead Technological Evolution from the C-Suite. Before we get to that though, Marcus, we'd love to know a little bit more about you. Whereabouts did you grow up, and how has your upbringing helped contribute to who you've become?
Yeah, thanks, Mahan. You could probably tell from my accent, I grew up in London, so I'm a proud Londoner. And I was the child of two Jamaican immigrants who were part of something called the Windrush Generation, which was a program started by the United Kingdom in the 1950s that brought 500,000 Jamaicans to the United Kingdom. And those people had such a huge impact on the country that it's a holiday now. And there is actually a museum that stands as a monument to their contribution. And what it meant to me is that I arrived into this world born to two parents who were massive Anglophiles. They'd been in the UK for 5 or 6 years by the time that I was born. And they just wanted me to learn everything about the country. They wanted me to have a super traditional British life. So I went to a 400-year-old high school for
Oh, wow.
Lassana. Ultimately, I went to Cambridge University, so got to experience an 820-year-old university. And I like to think of myself as a great distillation of everything that's great about being Jamaican. So that sort of fun-loving, no problem spirit, hopefully some warmth and some energy. But at the same time, all of the great things that you get from being British and the discipline and the structure and the love of rigor. And so that's me. In a nutshell, I think of myself as a great representative of both cultures.
What a beautiful mix, because I can see from your insights you have some of that rigor, and from your enthusiasm, smile, and energy, which anyone who gets a chance to watch the podcast can see for themselves. That warmth comes across, which is wonderful to see as well, Marcus. Now,
Thank
you focus your book to a certain extent on transformation. You said you went to a 400-year-old high school and Cambridge University 850 years old. These institutions have survived for hundreds of years, and none of the meteors seem to have impacted them, Marcus. Is it that they have handled transformations well, or is it that they still have not been hit by one of the meteors yet?
What a great question. I never thought about it in the context of my alma maters. I will tell you that in both cases, I think they were founded by innovators. Cambridge origin story is fascinating. Oxford had been the first university, but it was surrounded by controversy because they were doing things like anatomy investigations, and a lot of people thought it was connected with something nefarious. And so some of the more forward-thinking people actually left Oxford and went across the UK to Cambridge and created a new university there. And they were just reacting to the realities of the challenges that the British society was facing in the 11th century. So very interesting the thing there. And then Latimer, here's an interesting thought. So Latimer was founded by Charles Edward Latimer, and he had a really radical belief in the 1600s. He believed that intelligence was not directly correlated with wealth and status. And so his radical policy was that if you could educate poor people from the streets, you could make them as successful and as impactful to society as those that came from wealthy families. And in fact, above the school, it still says, and the building has been there since 1624, it says school for poor boys, which was considered radical. And so maybe that's why they stood the test of time, because that is in the culture of the organizations. And I think that's a powerful way to stay ahead of the curve.
It is powerful, and I find it interesting, Marcus, in that one of the things that AI is doing is bringing down the cost of information and you could argue access to intelligence to almost nothing and available to everyone. So maybe those schools, in a certain extent, are ahead of the curve, while a lot of schools have focused traditionally on the knowledge sharing, the information sharing, and valuing so-called intelligence a lot more.
Yes, I think that's true. And look, it's no surprise that Cambridge University has created a disproportionate number of Nobel Prize winners, people like Stephen Hawking and Isaac Newton. And I think it's this idea that you need to challenge the status quo that's really important and obviously has helped. But it's interesting, you mentioned AI. Does AI help to challenge the status quo, or does it help to propagate the status quo?
I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
So I will start by warning you and your listeners that my thoughts may be a little bit provocative and controversial. Back in 2024, I was back in London and I was asked to speak at a conference about AI, and by a very successful AI startup that's making lots of money from its clients. And I actually said that I thought only 5% of investments in AI would actually deliver any return on investment. And there were some people on stage from companies like Accenture and Gemini, and they were very upset with this comment. And I said, the reason for that is that to use AI, you need to give your new systems access to incredible volumes of data. Those data need to be clean, accurate, credible, and they need to be the right source of data. And most companies haven't actually fixed their underlying data problems in a way that would allow them to unlock the power of AI. Those companies that do have fantastic data models, and I will use Apple as an example, or National Geographic, these organizations are already leading the pack in their particular sector. AI is going to allow them to accelerate even further. And so it's a controversial view, but I have a suspicion that AI becomes something that helps to separate the leaders from the laggards. And if you're an organization that has failed to invest in technology for 10 years, your CIO has been faced by consistent budget cuts and you don't have talent, AI is going to exacerbate your problem.
What I hear from you is that AI, to a certain extent, becomes an accelerant for the organizations that already have their act together, primarily based on that data. And for others, I couldn't agree with you more in that it can become almost like a weight that brings them to average. So they are not tapping into anything special or any special intelligence. Now, you already mentioned National Geographic. You've had incredible experience involved in big transformations, whether at Marks and Spencer, retailers in the UK, for any of the US listeners that are not familiar with them, National Geographic, Google, even Apple. When did you realize that in a lot of organizations, leaders don't see the meteor coming?
Yes, just another fantastic question, Mahan. I'll tell you that, and I have to make a comparison here. Hopefully, it's an interesting comparison because both these organizations are the same age. They were both started in the 1880s. And so Marks and Spencer's and National Geographic were both started in the 1800s, just 4 years apart. Here's what's interesting. If we start with National Geographic, that organization came into the world driving innovation. I can tell you that back in 1906, they published the first ever flash photography in the magazine, and it led to outcry. There was outrage. In fact, some of the board members of National Geographic actually resigned. And these pictures are fascinating. They're just these deer that were caught in a flash and never been seen before, and they were clearly shocked, and hence deer in the headlights. So it's fascinating to me that organization always embraced innovation, and today has the largest following in the digital world on social media. No other organization comes close. It is the crown in the jewel, or the jewel in the crown, I should say, for Disney that acquired 21st Century Fox several years ago. But if we compare National Geographic to Marks and Spencer, what's interesting there is that's an organization that has focused on a certain level of operational excellence as it relates to retailing. Buy cheap, buy quality, sell at the right price, target to the customers. But unfortunately has always struggled with technology. And so part of the challenge when I was there, I was leading the global digital business. Part of the challenge was that the level of innovation and change that you need in technology to be successful at embracing the power of the internet or the power of e-commerce wasn't there. And in the book, I talk about this reluctance to change leads to a kind of ossification, where I remember going into the data center and there was lots of older equipment there because people were proud to say that I'm still running this server 20 years later. Here's the difficulty. One of the meteors that was coming, and I was at Marks and Spencer in 2016, was people wanting to buy food online. And I remember having heated conversations in the boardroom where I would say, look, we've got to be selling food. And people would push back and say things like, it's not the right experience. You can't smell it. You can't touch it. You can't look at it. And therefore, that's never going to be how we sell food. And I was literally thinking, but I can almost see out of the boardroom window, I can see this meteor coming towards us. And it was no surprise to me then that several years later, under pressure from shareholders, the company had to quickly pivot. And they found a pretty clever way of selling food online, but they had resisted that up until that time. Compare that to National Geographic, where I remember one evening vividly, I was in my office overlooking the front of the building in Washington, D.C. And it was about 6 p.m. My meetings had finished for the day. The CEO came in, Declan Moore, fantastic CEO. And he said, hey, I want to talk more about how we're going to change the way in which content gets in front of our customers. Talk to me about this content management system idea that you have and what can we do to really maximize that? So there he was, the CEO, after a busy day of meetings, coming to my office as the CTO to come and talk about this because he was so passionate about making sure that he was setting his organization up for success. And to give you an example of just how radical the thinking was, whereas in the previous company, there was a lot of resistance to change. He wanted to drive change. And one of the things he was super excited to do is change the way in which journalists and content producers were incentivized. And he said, why don't we create some sort of dashboard that shows the level of engagement, the level of advertising revenue, and then that will encourage people to produce the sort of content that we need for the future. Now, he was right, but some people didn't like it. And that process there of establishing that as the new standard helped him to move the organization into the digital world. Every day, National Geographic serves over 350 million consumers.
What brilliant examples, Marcus. Both of those that we can literally spend hours on. That's why your book is an outstanding read. I want to touch on a couple of elements of each one of those. First of all, with National Geographic, as a school kid growing up, I still remember flipping through those beautiful pictures. And if you had projected forward and told me what the world would be like right now, and you had asked me what organizations or publications would not have a shot at staying around, I would have put National Geographic on top of it. So for anyone and any organization that thinks change is not possible, they can just look at the National Geographic example. And I'm sure at National Geographic, as you mentioned the case was at Marks and Spencer, there were tons of reasons why this doesn't make sense. I can even visualize being in that boardroom, people saying, you can't smell the food, you can't touch the food. Why would anyone want to do that? So there are always lots of reasons for us not to want to be more sensitive and aware of that meteor that you saw coming. So why is it that smart executives find reasons not to see the meteor And what can we do to become more sensitive and more aware of the potential meteors for our organizations?
Yeah, another great question. One of my favorite astronauts, and having worked at National Geographic, I can say that because I met a couple, is Dr. Mae Jemison. And she was the first African American female in space and one of the longest people, had one of the longest times in space. And she encourages people to look up. And she's only telling them to look up at the sky, but she's also telling them to look up from what they're doing. She says, because there is a world around us that if we are not careful, we can miss all of the joy and all of the beauty because we're super focused on our particular life and what we're doing. And I think that philosophy applies very well to executives. I believe that where we are today is that we have created a world where we have executives who are successful, but they've delivered success. And their comfort zone then is the things that they did in order to become successful. And many of the people that have told me, oh, we don't do it that way, or no, it would be impossible to change. These are people who were phenomenally successful as they are building their career over 15 or 20 years. But you're now asking them to do something completely different. And particularly in the technology space, which is where I'm focused, people become very wedded to systems and models and patterns that they've used before. It's very hard to tell people to put those to one side because that's how they became successful. But if you look in certain cultures and certain companies, what you will see is that executives have been focused not on some sort of operational excellence per se, but they've been focused on driving their outcomes. And so someone like Declan, what was interesting about him as a CEO is that when he started out, his KPI was to make sure that the magazine was delivered on time into people's houses. But then for him, he didn't obsess about the process of doing that. He obsessed about the outcome. And as he got more senior in his career, he was hungry to know what the outcome was. And the outcome that really drove National Geographic's digital transformation was this obsession with delivering value to the customer. And for him as the CEO, he understood that would look different in 2025 to how it looked in 2015. And so we need executives to really be comfortable with looking up and thinking about what does the future bring, but stepping away from the things that made them successful and focusing on delivering their outcomes. And the outcomes could be more different. I didn't mention this, but sadly, Marks and Spencer last year saw its gross profits drop by 99% as a result of a massive ransomware attack that took down most of its technology. That's the downside of having people who focus on what they do rather than on the change that they need to be driving.
So those outcomes are essential, Marcus. Now, when we fast forward post-transformation, everything makes sense, whether at National Geographic or initially at Marks and Spencer with the app. However, when we are talking about the need for transformation and the meteor, there is a lot of hesitance and resistance, especially for these organizations that have a certain level of legacy and heritage. It's as if you are going at the core of what the organization is all about. The way people define the organization is tied into sometimes formats of delivery as opposed to the outcomes that you're mentioning. So how can we separate ourselves to be able to at least bring enough of the executives along toward those outcomes rather than you're killing the goose that lays the golden egg?
Yeah, part of it is finding that coalition of the willing. So one of the interesting things I've seen in successful transformations is that you have successful executives, but they do care about the future, and often they care about the customers. They really care about the customers, and they know that the world is changing. They obsess about what the customers are doing and how they have to react to it. versus other organizations where, and you could say rightly or wrongly, the executives are focused on the business, and the business being the machinery and the processes and how we do things. And that's where I found it much harder to take people on the journey. But you have a mix typically of those sorts of executives in most companies. And so building that coalition of the willing is key. As a technology leader, I believe that your most important partnerships will always be the teams that are driving the revenue. So make sure the things that you're doing are helping them to deliver more revenue. The teams that are actually taking care of the customers, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for technology to enable and to improve customer experience, and the finance teams. And one of the biggest compliments that I was ever paid when I was working in Silicon Valley, I don't remember what prompted it, but one of my colleagues from finance, she said to me when we were wrapping up a meeting, she says, "Hey, if ever you get bored of technology, we'd love to have you over in finance. I think we can make a good finance analyst out of you." And those relationships, if you build them and you choose the people that can form this coalition of the willing, I think it allows you to get some traction and move forward. But the truth is, you cannot take everybody on the journey. And if you try to get everybody to see the world as you see it, you will probably never deliver value. You have to find that coalition of the willing, identify the quick wins, execute.
Marcus, do you believe that this is relevant to all types of organizations? In that I've also used and seen examples of whether it's the Blackberries of the world or Blockbusters or Kodaks of the world, you name it. And I find in many instances, people that might be in professional services or in nonprofits or government organizations, they say, aha, that's a technology company or that's a product company. In case of Marks and Spencer or Walmart, they're retailers.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think this is something that relates to all organizations, or the slower moving sectors and industries are somewhat immune from these meteors?
Another great question, because this affects everyone. And I'll give you a specific example. If we go back earlier in my career, I was very fortunate to be at Comic Relief, a big nonprofit in the UK. They're famous for the Red Nose Day campaign, which now takes place in the United States too. Very interesting. When I arrived, the founder of Comic Relief, Richard Curtis, who is known for his great comedy and for being someone that's just a fantastic storyteller, he's perhaps not as recognized for being a wonderful innovator. And he told me and the rest of the team, the world is changing. Comic Relief had done pioneering work around telethons, where you have your TV show and you get people to ring up. Even as early as 2008, 2009, he was obsessing about the fact that the world was going to go digital and pushed hard to make changes in the organization. So me arriving there was part of that change. And it was a very high risk strategy. I was able to build a coalition of the willing, looking at the technology that was being used. And I said, we've got to do something different. And so I conceived with my team a new platform called Frost, Fundraising Operating System 2. And we said the future is going to be web, digital, and we needed to embrace the power of this crazy thing called the cloud in order to deliver. And so I remember it vividly. March the 18th, 2011, I was in the BBC headquarters. Adele was singing on stage just below. And my team was busily checking all of the servers as we were getting ready for a huge flow of donations coming in. And we had big tech companies there, Cisco, Oracle, Hewlett Packard, Apple. They were very interested to see how this all worked out for us. We built a system in Frost and a donations platform alongside it that worked so well, it set records that night for scalability and credit card transaction throughput. And in fact, some of your listeners might be saying, oh, I don't believe anybody would pay attention to a charity. I went from Comic Relief to Apple because Apple, having seen that, said, hey, those skills, that expertise could be applied to our business. So just imagine being headhunted from a nonprofit to go and work for the world's largest company. These principles apply across the board, in my opinion.
What an outstanding example, because you are right. And sometimes what it takes is for people to hear an example like that, to be able to visualize the impact on their organization and their industry. Now, Marcus, you also talk in your book about the shift from systems to platforms. What is the simplest way for a non technical executive to understand the difference?
Yes, and this is a critical point of success when those organizations are able to transform. The best way to think of it is that systems have often built to deliver a particular process or a particular business model. So you can often think of them as having one or a small number of purposes, and they could do that very well. For example, to bring it to life to the listeners, at T-Mobile, there was a system that had been built for something called the Jump program, which allowed people to change their mobile phone and upgrade it every 2 to 3 years. It was a system that just did that, nothing else. The challenge is that when you want to then tweak that process or tweak the proposition, the system has not been designed to accommodate that change. You built it to do that thing beautifully. When you move into the platform world, what you are doing is you're decomposing these systems into features and functions, and then you package them in these long-lasting groups of capabilities that can evolve over time and are not tied to a particular business process or a particular business model. They're designed to be flexible. So for example, at Apple, one of the best examples I would give is the self-service platform. It doesn't matter which product you're buying from Apple or how you're interacting with them. There's a self-service platform that lets you check your order, update your address, do the changes, add things to your order. And as Apple introduces new products, like it did with the Apple Watch in 2015, that new business can just take advantage of those existing capabilities. Whereas in the systems world, you end up with a very challenging environment for changing things. And I'll give you an indication, actually, to give you an idea of how different it can be. When Apple was introducing the iPhone upgrade program, which is that ability to every 18 months to do is just upgrade your phone, we built that in about 9 months, and the cost was single-digit millions. That's just because your platforms, you update your platforms and you build some new experiences. Many telcos around the world, when they have tried to implement something similar just for their business, it has taken years. In fact, some of them have failed to do it. And the price tag is sometimes in excess of $100 million because they are having to potentially fix 15 different systems that talk to each other instead of a platform that is designed to support the future. That's the simplest way to think of it.
And that is a powerful shift in thinking about how the organization operates. One of the things I wonder, Marcus, is what does that mean with respect to the talent or the people side of the organization?
You have hit the nail on the head of probably the most important principle. And in the book, I talk about different dinosaurs. And one of those sets of dinosaurs, of course, is people. Talent is a huge inhibitor or an accelerant. And when shifting from that system to that platform mindset, once again, you're having to reward people differently. So I would hear things in systems-oriented companies. People would introduce themselves to me and say, hey, my name's Jane, and I run system A. Okay, thanks, Jane. In a platform company, typically the person would introduce themselves and say, hey, my name is Ella, and I'm responsible for customer service, because the orientation is different. So that's one of the things that you have to look for. Some people can get a lot of comfort from being given a thing and owning a thing and taking care of that thing. But that's why we have so many legacy systems. On average, companies are spending 70% of their IT budgets just keeping those legacy systems alive. And very few of those companies are happy with those legacy systems. But you have people that have wrapped their arms around those systems because that's where they get their joy, that's where they get their comfort. Similar to the executives that I talked about, if you could pivot them to be focused on outcomes, then the technology becomes irrelevant. And I think as a tech leader, I probably was quite unusual early in my career. I joined IBM, and IBM had a vast array of products, which was fantastic. But when configuring a solution, sometimes I would go outside of IBM and I would say, actually, I think the best component here is Oracle. And some people, they were like, Marcus, no, we build everything like end to end IBM, but I was introduced to this idea of best in class. And sometimes you buy it, sometimes you build it. I don't care about the technology. And I built some great systems and I'm proud of those systems. And I built some great platforms. I'm proud of those platforms. But my joy came from the outcomes that those things delivered. And if I had to ditch the technology that I had built in order to deliver better outcomes, I'd have no problem doing that. That's not typical of human nature and not typical of technologists. I've seen people who have got servers that are 25 years old and they're super happy to keep that thing running. I would get no joy from that. Nostalgia has no place in technology management as far as I'm concerned.
It doesn't. And one of the things that you have repeatedly mentioned, Marcus, is that outcome focus and orientation. Now, I am also a big advocate of that. One of the challenges I've seen is there aren't too many executives that you run into where they think they are not, their organization is not, or the team is not outcome oriented the way you're describing it. So, how do you know whether you are really outcome oriented or not?
Yes. Another fantastic question. I'm reminded of an interesting QBR, so Quarterly Business Review, that I was part of. And I was running a big digital organization, I had multi-billion-dollar P&L responsibility. And then one of my peers as the CIO was responsible for running all of the tech infrastructure. And my team had gone first. And so we talked about the revenues and the customer satisfaction and the conversion rates and all of the things that we thought were really important. And so we got a thumbs up. It said, this is great. You're delivering fantastic outcomes for the business. What was interesting was that the CIO then came to give his presentation and presented some very interesting data, but data that nobody else in the business understood or cared about. So he was talking about his server availability and application uptime and ping availability and latency on the network and all of these fantastic things that he believed were outcomes. But to be frank, they were just KPIs for his operational systems. And I believe that real business outcomes should deliver true value for the organization and for your customers. And I'm a simple soul. When I started working for IBM many years ago, I was fortunate as a 22-year-old to be invited to listen to Lou Gerstner speak. And I was my brain was still a bit of a sponge back then. I was taking everything in. And Lou Gerstner said, business is very simple. You make your customers happy, they will spend more money with you, and you make more profits. And I sat there looking around the auditorium thinking, all of you must know this already because I'm the only one making notes here. And that training and that experience got me to understand that the metrics that matter are the ones that drive your business. The business that I run today, I run a large e-commerce business for a big software company. I care about the conversion rate. I care about the average order value. I care about net promoter score. And ultimately, all of that ties back to the revenue that we deliver for the organization. But I've met many digital experts who talk about traffic and they talk about reach and these other metrics. And so, yes, they think they're delivering outcomes, but I believe that the true outcomes are the ones that the business really needs to survive.
And I would submit, Marcus, in most of the leadership teams and organizations that I've been involved with, when I have actually challenged them on the outcomes, they haven't been outcomes. You said it beautifully with respect to the CIO that they had a bunch of KPIs, measures that would make them feel good, feel like they're tracking things. But if someone challenged them, are these really outcomes? They wouldn't have been able to show that. So that is something essential, I find, for leaders to reflect on. And what a wonderful opportunity for you at 22 to hear Lou Gerstner, who recently passed away,
That's right.
brilliant business person. And the fact that I would imagine vast majority of people at that time when they were listening to him, they were nodding, assuming they knew what he is saying. You were young, fresh, and open minded enough to really reflect on what he was saying. Now, you've mentioned a couple of the dinosaurs. I'm wondering, from your perspective and your experience, Marcus, what are some of the most common dinosaurs that you think we need to be aware of in our organizations?
There are three examples that I'd like to share. We've touched upon some of them. I think the executives who are resting and vesting, they had a great career. They really enjoyed what they did. They don't want to change it. And they will do what they can to gently resist. There's a lot of passive aggressiveness from these executives where they will nod happily in the meeting and agree that, yeah, that's the plan, but will then go back to their teams and say, we're not doing that. We're going to stick to what we've been doing. We're very frustrating for CEOs because I've seen multiple times as a consultant and executive, the CEO doesn't understand why the stuff is not happening. That's why the stuff is not happening. I'd say the next important set of dinosaurs are, and you talked about the sacred cows. These are the legacy systems that were built in-house. Companies just will not let those things go. In one company I worked in, one of the teams had a platform that was costing us $45 million a year to run. It was hated by all of the users. It had multiple, as in thousands of cybersecurity risks and issues. And when I asked the people that loved that system, because they did love it, like why it was built in the first place, and they said it's because we couldn't trust Salesforce. We were going to buy Salesforce like 10 years ago, but then we thought, what if they steal all of our customer data? So we decided to build our own version of Salesforce instead. And they were spending $45 million a year keeping this thing alive. So that's the next group of dinosaurs that just have to be absolutely dealt with. And then the third set of dinosaurs, interestingly, is operating model. Because we've talked a lot about technology and people, but how it all comes together is also important. And one of the things that I have a personal aversion to is a kind of contracted client and supplier relationship between technology and other parts of the business, where everything is through a ticket and everything is predicated through SLAs. I can tell you that at places like Apple and Google, that's not how it works. How it works there is that the engineers and the designers are sitting down with the people who maybe are the business owners and the sales and marketing team. They're problem solving together. They're defining the vision together, and they are celebrating successes together. And Google just became, or Alphabet, I should say, became a $4 trillion company. Just remarkable how quickly things can get done in Google when you see those cross-functional teams coming together. They built within the company an operating system, and Apple. I've been in both of those companies, so maybe I'm a little bit biased, but they put the right people together. That's their operating model. They don't allow themselves to be wrapped up in these very convoluted processes. You hardly ever see consultants running around in those companies. It's really simple. Have a problem identified, build a business case, put the best minds onto the problem. And so organizations where it's very heavily internally regulated, where you must submit a ticket. The number of times I've been to a conference and somebody stopped me and said, hey, I read about that thing that you did, or I saw your presentation. My IT department is telling me that it's going to take 2 years for them to deliver the thing that I've asked for. And it's going to take 6 months for them to estimate it. And I said, that's because you've got a customer or client and supplier relationship. They're running their things over here. They want you to make requests to them next. Bring it together, joint vision making, joint decision making, joint success.
To do that, Marcus, a couple of things that I see getting in the way oftentimes are budgets and compensation or incentives, however you want to call it. How would you approach that in order to get the kind of collaboration and effort that you were talking about?
Yeah, there's no doubt that people do what they're paid to do. And if you measure it, often it will be something that takes on a life of its own. So you do have to change the incentives. A good example would be in the telecommunications industry. Many companies have tried to just adapt and to really change the experience so that you don't have to go into the store and spend 5 hours to make the changes to your account that you wanted to make. But they consistently failed to do that. And one of the reasons they've consistently failed, and I only discovered this when I went to T-Mobile, and it was very apparent to me, is that many of the people working in those retail stores get most of their commission by getting those people to come into the store and do those things. And so when somebody calls and says, hey, I'd like to add a line to my account, please can you tell me how to do it? The answer is, yeah, come to the store and we'll get it done for you, because that's where their commission comes from. I will say it was interesting at T-Mobile seeing how changing the commission structures, simple thing, giving people a bonus for getting the customer to do it themselves on their phone. Now you have tracking and attribution challenges, not quite as easy to track, but as soon as you start to incentivize people for the better, more innovative behaviors, your business gets way, way better. But then you may stumble across these executives that we talked about earlier who love the way that things work and don't want change because they grew up in that system. The last thing they want you to do is change that system. So it's not easy to implement these changes, but when you do, they can be profoundly beneficial.
So I'm wondering from your perspective, Marcus, if every leader listening to this took just one step this week to identify and confront the dinosaurs in their organization, what in your view would that step be?
I think the first thing that they have to do is take an honest look at their organization and ask themselves why the things that they desire are not being delivered. And I have seen this, apart from the big tech companies that I've worked in, I've seen this in so many organizations. The CEO's vision is clear. The CEO gets it. The board gets it because the board are bringing the external perspective. They get it. Activist investors get it. But somehow, as the CEO tries to transmit this thinking into the organization, it breaks down. And people have to be honest about why it is. I remember I was a couple of years ago, I was doing some consulting for one of the big consulting firms. And I found myself sitting in an office with a CEO of a big company, the global market leader in their field, based in Texas. And he just said, explain to me what's going on with IT. And I said, the things, most IT projects fail, most go over budget, most are expensive. These are the challenges that you have. I talked about systems versus platforms, and he leaned over and said, that's exactly what is happening in my organization. But Marcus, I told them to stop. I told them to stop. So why isn't it happening? And I actually said to him, come to the session that I'm running this afternoon with your tech leadership. Just listen to the sort of conversations that were being had. And he did. It was interesting because it was quite a long session. He went on till about 9 p.m. at night. And the CEO, I don't know how he cleared his calendar. He just sat there for the whole thing. And afterwards said to me, I get it. I'm asking these people who have never done this thing before to magically do it. All of these people have worked in my company for 15, 20 years. And I'm asking them, why are they not building the future of our business? And I get it, because listening to the conversation that you're facilitating, they're doing their best, but they're not prepared to change. And I don't have enough outside influence. And so he understood in that moment what was the blocker and was able to put in program with some help from some consulting firms to fix it. Be honest about what is stopping you from executing as beautifully as you would like to, and then deal with that thing.
What a beautiful question. As Warren Berger talks about the power of beautiful questions, that's a beautiful question for us to ask ourselves in our teams and organizations, because it will start us understanding the challenges and therefore what it takes to address them. So, Marcus, for the audience to find out more about you, read your book, and follow your work, where would you send them to?
Thank you. I would say my personal website is a great place to start. It's marcuseast.com. Please take a look there. It will tell you a little bit about me and my career. One of the things we didn't touch upon was this idea that life or the universe has given me such a unique opportunity, and that I've spent exactly half my career working for big tech companies, IBM, Apple, Google, Autodesk, and the other half working for non-tech companies, often legacy companies, Marks and Spencer, National Geographic. And so, having seen what's happening in both of those worlds, I hope that I've injected into my book some insights based on acknowledging the problems. And sometimes I've seen there are tech people who can talk really good tech, or there are strategists on the non-tech side who can talk great strategy, but I think I've been able to straddle both. And hopefully my website and my LinkedIn profile are great places to start to learn a little bit more about me.
You have done a beautiful job of that, Marcus. I so appreciate the conversation and your book, Marcus, Working with Dinosaurs, How to Lead Technological Evolution from the C-Suite. Thank you so much for this conversation, Marcus East.
Thank you for having me, Mal. It's been an absolute pleasure.